Welsh Labour, they've been the most successful Democratic Party in history. They've been the largest party in Wales in every election since 1920. So Labour are under pressure in Wales from Plaid on the left, Reform on the right. They were never, ever going to be able to get their budget through under Vaughan Gething because they don't have a majority in the Senate, and no other party said they'd support him. We got an election in Wales in less than 2 years, and I think it could be the first time that Welsh Labour dominance could big thing could be under threat.
Will, welcome to Politics Joe.
Thanks for having me.
How would you like to introduce yourself?
I am the Welsh Affairs Editor at Wales Online.
Excellent. The Politics Joe audience might not follow Welsh politics that closely, which is a real shame. And if they wanted to get stuck in, you're obviously the best place to start, I think. But right now, Vaughan Gething, the First Minister of Wales, historic figure in not just Welsh politics, kind of European politics. He was the first black head of government in Europe. He's stepping down after a kind of unbelievable series of scandals, self-inflicted, some of them, you might say. Can you summarise what went wrong for him?
Yeah, so Vaughan Gething, as you say, was the first black leader of a European nation, a really, really historic event. And I would say every right-thinking person in Wales was really proud of that. And I think it was a mark of how inclusive and welcoming Wales is. The problem is, since he took over, even before that, it's been dogged by essentially scandals around a donation he took. So he was running to replace Mark Drakeford. So Mark Drakeford was the Welsh Labour leader and was the first minister. He's probably the most well-known Welsh politician, probably because of the pandemic. And he was running against a guy called Jeremy Miles. And in that leadership race, Vaughan Gething took a £200,000 donation from a man who had convictions for environmental crimes. His company had dumped waste on a nature reserve, a conservation area. And it wasn't just the fact that where the money was coming from, it was the amount of money. So £200,000 in a Welsh politics context is absolutely huge. So the spending limit was only 44,000. And over the course of that, Mr. Gething spent 5 times more than his opponent, Jeremy Miles. Mr. Gething ended up winning that contest, but a few other things have transpired. So on the same day that company made a donation to Mr. Gething, they also put in an application to build a solar farm outside of Cardiff, and that solar farm would have required Welsh Government approval. So you're in a situation where the company donating to Mr. Gething will require his government to approve a application. But there was other things as well. Now, it's important to stress there's no suggestion of any illegality or any rules being broken during this. But for a lot of people, they felt there were questions to answer around ethics and judgment. Now, what then happened was it came to light that the same company who made that donation of £200,000 just 11 months before received a donation of that same company who gave him £200,000 received a loan of £400,000 just 11 months before from the Development Bank for Wales. Now, the Development Bank for Wales is wholly owned by the Welsh Government, and the man responsible for it at the time was Vaughan Gething. Again, there's no suggestion of any illegality or even rules being broken, but people were questioning the links between this company that had donated money to Mr. Gething and the historic links between him and that company, which were now essentially bankrolling him into being the most powerful man in Wales. So he won the election, but to be the Welsh Labour leader and therefore First Minister in the Senev, so the Senev is the Welsh Parliament. But there was a lot of bitterness and bad blood between different sides of Welsh Labour because some people felt like, well, he's got this through this donation. That's how he's taken this role. But then things just got worse because he sacked a member of his own cabinet for leaking to the media. Now, what was leaked was a message group in which Mr. Gething says, I'm going to delete these messages because they can be captured by a Freedom of Information request. So just a few months before, he told the COVID inquiry that all of his messages had been lost when he changed phones. So people suggested, well, actually, maybe there's some more questions to answer here. Mr. Gething said, no, it wasn't to do with, it wasn't relevant to the inquiry. Anyway, he sacked that member of his government, and then this created a vote of no confidence in him within the Welsh Parliament. But he lost that vote. Now, the reason he lost that vote is because 2 of his own members didn't bother to turn up to vote for him. So the vote meant that he was, the institution in which he sits, the Senev in Wales, voted they had no confidence in him, but he refused to step down. Now, if you remember, Humza Yousaf in Scotland stepped down when there was even a suggestion he might lose a no confidence vote. And he was kind of saved, really, because then the election was announced and everyone suddenly got distracted by the election in Westminster. But now, just a few weeks after the election, he has four members of his government step down. They all resigned at the same time. And that led Mr. Gething to see that I think his time was up and he has now resigned himself. So it has not been, he has dreamed about that role since he was very young, so he says. And he's dreamed about that role since he was young. And that was part of his pitch to be the leader. And he was only in that job for a couple of months, all because ultimately he took this donation back in January.
What's interesting is, you've touched on this in your other reporting, is it seems avoidable. He could have behaved differently if he'd been more contrite. It might have been, you might still have support within the Senate.
Yeah, I think the donation is what hurt him, but I think a different political operator could have navigated that better, because when he was being asked about these donations, the only response he would give for over a month was, I have broken no rules. I have broken no rules. And I think when a politician says, just take my word for it, how dare you ask me this? I think that it was the reaction to the donations and the scrutiny, rather than the actual scrutiny itself, that did for him in the end. Because really, if he'd have come out and said, right, I know I've done nothing wrong, but I'm going to order a full investigation into this, and I will publish the findings of that, I think that people would have actually just forgotten about it. It was only because he refused to really properly engage with a discussion about the donations and completely acted as though any concerns or questioning was not legitimate. I think that's what rubbed the pub, because he's polling very, very poorly and his own members up the wrong way.
Let's touch on Welsh Labour. Welsh Labour has been unbelievably dominant in Wales. They have an electoral record any political party would be so proud of.
Yeah.
Where does this leave them?
Well, you're right to say that. I mean, Welsh Labour, I mean, they like to say this a lot as well. They've been the most successful democratic party in history. They've been the largest party in Wales in every election since 1920. Over 100 years of them being the largest party in Wales. But there's some real cracks starting to show. So since devolution, since Wales got control of a lot of its own affairs, so like health service, education, Welsh Labour have been in charge. They've run the Welsh government since 1999, so 25 years. And a lot of Wales's public services are massively underperforming. Now, you can argue that they have had a huge cut in funding from Westminster. The Conservatives have really cut the amount of money in real terms that the Welsh government have got to work with. But also, there are some huge issues with how Welsh services are run, a lot of people would argue. But the last election, so the general election just gone, Wales went down from 40 to 32 seats. And Welsh Labour won 27 of those seats. So Welsh Labour won 27 of 32 seats. So you see that and you think, blimey, they are completely dominant in Wales. But actually, if you look beneath the numbers, even though they won 84% of the seats, they got well below 40% of the vote. And they were the only part of the UK where the vote share went down. And really, they're under pressure from several different angles. They're under pressure from Plaid Cymru, which is our equivalent of like the SNP, it's the Nationalist Party. So Reform have made massive inroads in areas which are traditionally strong Labour holdouts, like Llanelli and in the valleys. And in Llanelli, they're actually really, really close to winning that seat, which is unthinkable because that is like the most Labour of Labour seats you can imagine. So Labour are under pressure in Wales from Plaid on the left, Reform on the right. And they were never, ever going to be able to get their budget through under Vaughan Gething because they don't have a majority in the Senate and no other party said they'd support him. So it's been that, although on the face of it, it looks like things are good. We've got an election in Wales in less than 2 years. And I think it could be the first time that Welsh Labour dominance could be under threat.
Do you think it's an incumbency problem if a political party is in power for as long as Welsh Labour have been, longer than the SNP, longer than the Conservatives in Westminster?
Yeah.
Is it just the government's too long in the tooth?
Yeah, I think there is no. I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that the government that was in power in England, Scotland, and Wales, the party in power, all saw quite a big fall in their vote. So the SNP, the Conservatives, and Welsh Labour. I think there's a strong argument that Welsh Labour are quite tired. Um, it's very hard. Democracy needs those renewals, those refreshes that of incoming governments. We've seen with when Labour have come in Westminster, um, there is a new energy about stuff, isn't it? It's not just the politicians; it's also the civil servants. It's that feeling of renewal, and we've never had that in Wales because Welsh Labour have always been the main party in charge. They've been in partnerships with people at Plaid. They've just come out of a cooperation agreement with Plaid, which actually happened because of Vaughan Gething triggered that to end early because of his sacking of Hannah Blythen. That's what caused Plaid to pull out. And we've just never had that in Wales. And I think in a way, that's understandable because Wales has got strong links to the Labour movement. We saw things with mining, the closure of the mines, and the strong union links. But also, as a polity, Wales is left of centre typically. There is not to say that there's not people on the right in Wales, but there's always been a slightly left leaning personality to Wales, and I think usually the place they'd have gone would be to Labour. Although historically, if you go back further than Labour, the Liberals were quite strong in Wales. So it's I think there has been a feeling that there has been no change and difference in Wales, and I think what they'll be hoping is a new leader, a new first minister comes in, and maybe that can be like it's a bit like Trigger's broom from Only Fools and Horses. You know, it's got a new handle. This is totally different. This is something completely new.
The next First Minister of Wales is going to have an enormous challenge, kind of winning the Welsh public back on side, restoring trust in the Welsh government. If you were advising that person, what do you think they should do? How could they do that? Is it even possible?
It's going to be very hard in 2 years, especially because they're not likely to get much money coming from Westminster. Analysis of the budget they're likely to receive suggests they are going to have to make some cuts across some certain key services. If they don't, if they pass on the increases in health and education spending that they'll be receiving from Westminster, they could actually be having to make cuts to other services. My advice to them would be, firstly, they need to maintain this differentiation between Welsh and UK Labour, this idea of the clear red water. That Welsh Labour, there's a reason that they have survived far better than Scottish Labour, and it's because they've got a much more defined brand from the country in which they operate. The reason Plaid Cymru have struggled to do as well as the SNP is in part because Welsh Labour was seen as so Welsh. You know, you see Mark Drakeford go up there. He was speaking Welsh, and that was quite a big thing. And he often tried to position Welsh Labour away slightly to the left of UK Labour. Vaughan Gething didn't do that as much. He was much more, I would say, aligned to the UK part of the party. And there's some people in Welsh Labour who think that's a really good thing. But I think if you're going to do that, you live and die by how UK Labour do. And it's on the up at the moment, but there's going to be a point in the next couple of years where it actually might be useful for Welsh Labour to be seen as fighting for Wales's corner against Westminster. But I don't know if there's going to be an inclination to do that because the party's so splintered and factional in Wales at the moment.
I think this affects support for devolution full stop in Wales in terms of if the only government if the only devolved government you've seen has been the same party for 25 years and people's quality of life isn't great, isn't improving under this government, do you think there could be the development of a call to just let's get rid of this?
I'm always loath to go to do this because actually there's been two referendums on devolution and the Welsh public both times have said we want it. If there's an issue in Westminster, you don't say, well, let's abolish Westminster, do you? I mean, some people might, but most people don't. They say we need a new government if things aren't working. And I think people conflate the Welsh government with devolution. And my argument to that is always, well, if I was driving through the mountains and my car broke down, I wouldn't say, well, I don't need a car anymore. I'd say I need a better car, wouldn't I? And I think that's what the habit we've got. Devolution is a vehicle for making things better in Wales. And if you if you change the people who are running that, potentially you'll get a different result. But people in Wales, like they're not robots. They've voted for Welsh Labour again and again because that's who they wanted. And you know, it doesn't mean that Welsh Labour haven't done. Well, there's been a lot of things Welsh Labour have done, which I think you can argue have been really good for Wales, and they've represented Wales. I mean, there's a consensus, if you look at polls, that Wales handled the pandemic better than England did. And I think some people were quite grateful that we had a different government at the time. That is by no means a view which is held across the board. But I think ultimately people want something that makes their lives better. And if devolution isn't delivering that, then you kind of have to ask yourself, why? Is it the government? Is it how devolution's set up? Because actually, if you look at how, like, why have Northern Ireland and Scotland got control of policing and trains, but Wales doesn't? It's so back of a fag packet how it's been designed. It's a surprise it works at all, I actually sometimes think. So I think there's arguments for rationalising it, but people who are advocates for devolution have Wales making more of its own decisions. It's in their interest for this to work and to deliver for people. And at the moment, you can't look at public services and think that the current Welsh government is delivering, because it just isn't.
Will, thank you so much for your time.